the fight for justice. The handcuffs bit into my wrists as Sheriff Diane shoved me toward her patrol car, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. My neighbors peeked from behind curtains, watching the scene unfold on our quiet Maple Lane. Diane's accusations about my illegal homeless camp echoed down the street, drowning out my attempts to explain that everything was fully permitted. When I held out my legal documents, she snatched them, tossed them into the mud, and ground them under her boot. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about the law. This was personal, and she had no idea what she'd just unleashed. 6 months earlier, life was simpler. I lived in a modest ranch-style home in a small Ohio town, the kind of place where folks still waved from their porches and kids biked until the streetlights flickered on. At 52, I'd spent years as a carpenter before settling into a quieter routine. But something always tugged at me, a need to give back, especially to veterans who'd served our country only to be forgotten back home. I'd seen too many of them sleeping in rusted cars or under bridges, their eyes hollow with defeat. Winter was coming, and the local shelters were bursting. My backyard was big, and I knew how to build. Why not do something? I didn't rush in blindly. I spent weeks calling the county planning office, meeting with inspectors, and filling out every form they threw at me. The permit process was a slog, months of red tape and fees, but I got it done. My garden shed became a proper emergency shelter, insulated, heated, with running water and separate sleeping areas. The county inspector, a gruff retiree named Ed, shook my hand when he signed off. "This is what our town needs, Tom," he said. "You're doing God's work." The first veteran to stay was James, a Marine who'd done 3 tours in Iraq. He'd come home to find his marriage gone and his job outsourced. For 2 months, he'd slept in his pickup. When he knocked on my door, his voice was barely a whisper. "Just need a warm place for the night," he said. "I'll pay when my VA check comes." I waved off the offer. This wasn't about money, it was about dignity. Word spread fast. Soon, my shelter was a lifeline for veterans across the county. Neighbors pitched in. Mrs. Carter next door brought quilts and chili. The Lopez family donated a couch. Even the grocery store started saving day-old bread. For 3 months, it felt like we were building something real. But small towns have a way of breeding small minds. Sheriff Diane Miller had been in law enforcement for 15 years, but she'd only been sheriff for 2, elected on promises to clean up the streets and protect property values. I'd voted for her opponent, a steady cop named Rogers, but I figured Diane would do her job fairly. Then I noticed her cruiser creeping past my house, slowing to a crawl as she eyed my shelter, jotting notes. I brushed it off. She was just being thorough, right? I had nothing to hide. I was wrong. The storm hit on a Tuesday at 8:45 a.m. I was sipping coffee when 3 patrol cars roared into my driveway, lights flashing. Diane stepped out like she was storming a cartel hideout, hand on her holster, sunglasses hiding her eyes. 2 deputies trailed her, looking uneasy. I recognized one from my old high school football team, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. I opened the door before they could knock, forcing a smile. "Morning, Sheriff. What's this about?" Her voice boomed for the whole street to hear. "You're running an illegal homeless camp, Tom. This shuts down now, or you're under arrest for violating city ordinances." My stomach dropped. Neighbors were already stepping onto their lawns, gawking. Mrs. Carter clutched her sweater, horrified. I kept my voice steady. "Sheriff, there's a mistake. I have permits, inspections, everything's legal. Want to see the paperwork?" I grabbed my folder of documents and handed it over. Diane barely glanced at it before tossing it back. "These don't matter," she snapped. "You're bringing riffraff into our town. This is a public safety issue, and I'm shutting it down." I couldn't believe it. Those papers were months of work, signed by the county. "Sheriff, these are legal documents," I said, heat creeping into my voice. "You can't ignore them." She stepped closer, her breath sharp with coffee. "I decide what's necessary to protect this town. You've got 24 hours to close this down, or I do it for you." The word homeless dripped from her mouth like poison. This wasn't about permits, it was about her hatred for the people I was helping. "These are veterans," I shot back. "They fought for this country. They're not riffraff." Her lips curled into a cold smile. 24 hours, she repeated, then strode back to her car. That night, I didn't sleep. Diane's words gnawed at me. I'd done everything by the book, but it didn't matter if she could rewrite the rules. By morning, I'd made up my mind. If she wanted a fight, she'd get one. I started calling first Ed at the county, who was stunned. "Your permits are solid, Tom," he said. She can't override us without a violation. He promised to dig deeper. I called the mayor's office, the county commissioner, even the state attorney general. Everyone took my info, but no one grasped the urgency. Meanwhile, the veterans were packing up. James stopped by, his duffel slung over his shoulder. "I don't want to cause you trouble," he said, eyes downcast. I begged him to stay, but he was gone by dusk. My shelter sat empty, a silent rebuke. Diane didn't stop. Over the next week, she showed up 3 more times, each visit a new excuse. My shelter was too close to the property line. It wasn't. There were noise complaints, impossible it was empty, then drug activity, a flat-out lie. She'd roll in with deputies, lights blazing, making a spectacle for the neighborhood. I started documenting everything: dates, times, what she said, who was there. I snapped photos of the empty shelter and backed up my permits. If this was war, I needed ammo. Then I dug deeper. Diane's 15-year career was a trail of buried scandals. 3 years ago, she'd hospitalized a homeless man for resisting arrest behind a store. The complaint vanished after the store owner campaign donor backed off. 2 years ago, she'd bulldozed a homeless camp without notice, destroying people's only belongings. A lawsuit was settled quietly. Last year, she jailed a volunteer for handing out sandwiches. The pattern was clear. Diane targeted the homeless and anyone who helped them. But why? I found the answer in her husband's construction firm, which kept winning contracts to build on land cleared of homeless camps. The store owner had sold his lot for millions after the problem was gone. Every time Diane struck, someone profited, someone tied to her. I wasn't alone. I met Ellen, a retired teacher arrested for feeding the homeless. She introduced me to a pastor harassed for letting people sleep in his church lot, a shop owner threatened with code violations, and a social worker reassigned for speaking out. Each had been crushed by Diane's tactics, but they were angry, ready to fight. The game changer was Mike, a former deputy who'd quit after 2 years under Diane. "She keeps files on troublemakers," he told me. "Anyone helping the homeless gets one, including you." He had copies, including mine. Diane had known my permits were legal. She attacked anyway because control, not law, was her goal. Evidence wasn't enough. I needed a plan: legal, political, public. Legally, I filed a complaint with the state attorney general, detailing Diane's civil rights violations, backed by Mike's files. I contacted the ACLU, who saw a winnable case. Politically, I leaned on county commissioners and state reps, sending them my evidence. Most hedged, but one commissioner, wary of Diane's allies, agreed to push for an investigation if I could rally public support. Publicly, I pitched the story to local news. Most shied away, but 2 reporters bit. I bought cameras to catch Diane's next move. This wasn't just my fight, Anna Marie, it was ours. The plan hinged on forcing Diane's hand. I'd reopen the shelter, not quietly, but with fanfare, media, witnesses, the works. If she backed down, I'd win. If she escalated, I'd have her on tape. I called my brother in Indiana, who worried I was in over my head. "What if she comes for you?" he asked. I thought about it. Diane could ruin me, but power thrives in shadows. I was about to light her up. At 5:30 a.m., I was wired, coffee in hand, triple-checking everything. By 7 o'clock, the pieces were set. 3 news crews were coming, Ellen and the coalition would trickle in. Mike was across the street with a camera, and a civil rights lawyer waited nearby. Mrs. Carter agreed to watch from her porch. At 8 o'clock, I hung a sign on the shelter, "Open for veterans in need." Then I waited. Diane arrived at 8:42 with 3 cruisers and a van, ready for a showdown. She didn't expect the cameras. A reporter from Channel 5 hit her with questions about civil rights complaints. Diane shoved the mic aside and stormed toward me. "You were ordered to shut this down," she barked. "You're under arrest." I held up my permits, voice clear for the cameras. "These are valid, Sheriff. You have no authority to override them." She grabbed the papers and tore them in half, snarling, "I decide what's legal here." The crowd gasped. Ellen stepped forward. "You arrested me for feeding people, Sheriff. Why do you hate those who help?" Diane's mask cracked. "These people bring crime and filth," she shouted. "They deserve what they get." The crowd booed. Even her deputies shifted uncomfortably. Then Mike spoke up. "I worked for you, Sheriff. I know about your files, your ties to developers who profit when homeless camps vanish." Diane froze, pale. "You signed a confidentiality agreement," she hissed. "Not to cover up corruption," Mike shot back. That was it. Diane's authority crumbled. She climbed into her cruiser and sped off, leaving her deputies stranded. The crowd cheered, but I felt only relief. The video hit the evening news, then went viral. By morning, it was everywhere. The commissioner called for an investigation. The mayor, silent for weeks, distanced himself. The governor's office promised a state probe. Within 72 hours, Diane was suspended, and the FBI was reviewing federal charges. More victims came forward: a pastor, a shop owner, a social worker filing complaints that painted a decades-long pattern of abuse. Mike's testimony about Diane's files and developer ties sealed her fate. 6 months later, she was indicted on federal civil rights charges and resigned. Her trial was swift. Guilty on all counts, 3 years in prison, banned from law enforcement. Her husband's firm collapsed under fraud charges. The real victory was the change. The new sheriff, Maria Torres, was a reformer who met with us to rebuild trust. Her department partnered with shelters, trained deputies on mental health, and answered to a civilian board I now serve on. My shelter grew to 3 buildings, housing 15 veterans. James, now the manager, turned his life around but stayed to help others. Downtown, a new service center replaced harassment with hope, boosting property values by tackling homelessness head-on. The fight took 2 years, but it reshaped our town. Justice wasn't just Diane's foul, it was a system that now protects the vulnerable. I speak at conferences now, sharing how ordinary people can fight corruption. The battle scars remain, but so does the pride. What do you think? Have you faced injustice or abuse of power in your community? Share your thoughts in the comments, especially on how we tackle violence and unfairness. Take a stand, speak your truth, and let's keep this conversation going.